We thought we had closure and that we could start to move on, but our world got flipped upside down all over again. It was one of those things you think can't happen in your town, but Haumea went out to grab food and never made it home. Haumea was murdered on August 31st, 2019. They were 16 and I had just turned 18. It's a time in my life I will never forget. The night Haumea went missing, my mom texted me asking if I had seen Haumea because Kai was starting to get worried. The food truck Haumea went to couldn't have been more than 10 minutes from our apartment, so Kai knew something was wrong when Haumea hadn't come back after more than an hour. Later that night, police found Haumea dead in a parking lot right by the food trucks. It was the worst night of my life. Kai was inconsolable and I lost my friend. The only solace any of us found was when Micah Opessa pleaded guilty and went to prison for Haumea's murder, but now they're trying to take that away.
Last year, I took the Dark Tourist to the small town of Harmony to investigate a bizarre string of events. In what turned out to be an eerily accurate prediction, Mrs. Funke, a Harmony native, predicted we would return to cover a new story. She was right. Just days ago, a teenager from Trillium High School was walked out of a courtroom to begin their sentence after pleading guilty to voluntary manslaughter. Micah Opessa is now behind bars for the murder of fellow classmate and former friend, Haumea Robins. According to official records, Haumea was murdered on August 31st, 2019, after stopping at a local food truck to grab a bite to eat. While the exact details of that night have not been made public, we do know that a food truck owner heard a gunshot and saw someone running from the parking lot with a gun. Police arrived moments later to find Haumea dead. We were able to interview a spokesperson from the prosecutor's office and Micah's attorney to fill in some of the details.
This really was an open and shut case, but trials can be difficult with a young victim and a young defendant, so we opted for a plea deal. Micah admitted to Detective Foley that they were at the food truck that night with Haumea to discuss an ongoing rift between the two of them. We had fibers, partial fingerprints, and a shoe print that all pointed back to Micah Opessa as the assailant.
The physical evidence that the state had could hardly be used to prove that Micah was guilty of murder, and the supposed motive was nothing more than a disagreement between friends. When I counseled my client, the most important factor was the eyewitness. Corey Abrams saying they saw Micah fleeing the scene was the only piece of evidence the state was presenting that made us nervous. Jurors love an eyewitness, and Micah was afraid that they would be convinced by Corey Abrams alone.
Plea deals are fairly common. Trials are expensive and they take time, so about 90% of cases end in plea deals. This situation is no different. We offered Micah a plea, they declined, so we continued to prepare our case. The prosecutor ultimately offered a second plea rather than risk going to trial and having the jury be sympathetic and view Micah as some innocent kid. If Micah had declined the plea offer, the prosecutor was fully prepared to go to trial. Micah knew they were guilty of murdering Haumea, accepted the plea that was offered, and is now serving their time.
Micah was never guilty. They said it from day one, never stopped saying it. I know a lot of people might say that an innocent person would never take a plea deal, but it's really not that simple. The court system doesn't work like you see in Law and Order. Sometimes innocent people get trapped in a situation where the risk of going to trial and getting a life sentence is just too big a risk to take. Micah was facing an impossible choice. They did what a lot of other innocent defendants have done before them. The choice to take a plea is a balancing act. Based on the case that the state has against you, you decide if it's worth the risk of going to trial. What we didn't know at the time was that Micah was making that judgment based on an incomplete knowledge of the state's case.
In criminal cases, the prosecutor has a duty to turn over evidence within their control that could be favorable to the defense. Some prosecutors just turn over their entire case file. It is only required that the prosecutor review all available evidence and turn over anything that has a reasonable probability of changing the verdict in a trial. This is what we call Brady material after a United States Supreme Court case, Brady v. Maryland. In the Opessa case, defense filed for discovery, and our office turned over everything we had at that time.
After the plea agreement was signed, Micah entered their plea and began serving the negotiated sentence. Only after the sentence began, however, did we discover that the prosecution withheld significant detail. We recently learned that the prosecutor knew and decided not to disclose that their star witness recanted their statement and is now saying that Micah wasn't the person they saw fleeing the scene. Entering into a plea agreement isn't something to take lightly. There's always a risk involved, and you are waiving several constitutional rights. For that reason, it is incredibly difficult to withdraw a plea. The circumstances have to be extraordinary, which is what we have here with Micah.
This is a desperate attempt by the defendant and their attorney to avoid serving prison time. Micah knowingly and voluntarily entered into a plea because they murdered Haumea Robins. That's all there is to it.
Withholding that evidence was an egregious violation of my client's constitutional rights, because the change in eyewitness testimony would very likely have led to a not guilty verdict at trial, and would certainly have changed whether they took the plea.
We vehemently disagree with defense's motion to withdraw their plea, and we will ask the court to deny that request. Plea withdrawals are only granted under the most extraordinary circumstances, which is why defense bears the burden of proof and will present their case first. There is no legal ground for the defense to stand on in this situation. For one thing, this case did not rest on the eyewitness testimony of Corey Abrams. If Micah Opessa had chosen to go to trial, a jury would have convicted them based on the overwhelming evidence and motive, even without the testimony of Corey Abrams. In all reality, none of that matters anyway. Defense's claim that the prosecutor committed such an egregious violation of Micah's constitutional rights that it warrants a plea withdrawal is unfounded. Prosecutors are not required to turn over their entire case file. In this situation, Justice Okafor provided Micah's attorney with a list of evidence and witnesses that included Corey Abrams. The defense was free at any point after that to interview Corey Abrams on their own, multiple times if they chose.
Our station spent a lot of time covering the Haumea Robins case, as did most local news outlets. I actually interviewed Haumea's parent, Kai Robins, on a few occasions. Kai was destroyed by their child's death. Grief can manifest in different ways, and it seemed like Kai channeled that grief into seeking justice for Haumea. I imagine that's why Kai decided to testify in this new trial. They will do anything to keep Micah Opessa in prison. Kai was certain Micah murdered Haumea. Kai talked to me about the changes they had seen in Micah when they got to high school and their overall concern with Micah being a bad influence on Haumea.
When Micah stopped coming around for a while, Kai thought the dust had finally settled until the most unimaginable thing happened, and Haumea was killed. That night, when Haumea didn't come home, Scout Farrat was still at Kai's apartment waiting for Haumea. When it became clear something was wrong, Scout broke down and showed Kai a screenshot of texts Micah had recently sent to Haumea. Kai believed these messages were threatening to Haumea, and that solidified in Kai's mind that Micah was the reason Haumea never came home. In my time as a journalist, I've covered a few high-profile cases, such as the Robins case, and I have to say that this one was and is complicated. Even the evidence in this case isn't as straightforward as it would seem. Before Micah took a plea, their attorney hired a private investigator named Charlie Nguyen, who was preparing to testify at trial to refute the physical evidence. If Charlie testifies this time around, I can imagine they will make a compelling witness. Charlie is a former detective and certified evidence technician turned private investigator. So when they say the physical evidence doesn't point to Micah as clearly as the prosecution claims, they have the details to back it up. Charlie spent a great deal of time picking apart the partial fingerprint and the way it was analyzed, as well as the way in which the evidence ended up at the crime scene in the first place. Even after several years of reporting on this kind of thing, much of the technical details are over my head. This case is also unique because Micah will take the stand in their own defense. Attorneys usually try to avoid putting their client on the stand because it can be risky, but Micah is the only one who can explain their relationship with Haumea and their version of the events on the night of the murder. Micah's attorney was adamant that they should not give interviews back before the sentencing and again now. On a whim, I tried writing to Micah at the beginning of the sentence saying that they had finally had a chance to tell their side of the story if they wanted. I was surprised but pleased when Micah wrote back. I was wrongly accused and convicted of murdering a person who I loved and cared for dearly, Haumea Robins. That's not to say that Haumea and I didn't have problems in the past, or that I have always been a perfect person. Like everyone else, I struggle and I have made mistakes, many of them in fact, but murder is absolutely not one of them. I love Haumea and I would never do anything to hurt them, not in a million years. Micah Opessa.
I worked the Robins case with Detective River Foley in late August of 2019. Cases involving kids are always difficult, and the Robins case was hard on both of us. We were glad to finally get justice for their family. We won't stop trying to get justice even now, with whatever stunt Opessa is trying to pull. Foley was prepared to testify at trial back then, so I know they'll testify this time around. We did solid police work and collected the evidence we needed to put Opessa behind bars a year ago. Foley will see to it that the court hears the evidence this time around and understands that we came to Opessa as the murderer. There were fibers, partial fingerprints, and a shoe print that all pointed to Opessa as the suspect. Opessa even admitted to having a bad relationship with Haumea, and their text messages and social media proved all of that. That was enough to make the arrest and charge of Opessa with murder. Foley will explain this all during the new trial, but sometime between Opessa's arrest and their guilty plea, Foley got a call from the eyewitness who was second-guessing their identification of Opessa. After seeing a news story with video of Opessa, I guess they weren't as confident that Opessa was the person they saw fleeing the crime scene. Foley took it in stride, knowing there was plenty of other evidence against Opessa. Foley did their due diligence anyway and mentioned it to the prosecutor so they could look into it further. It's never a great feeling when someone you put behind bars tries everything in their power to get out. But I know Foley and the prosecutor will set the record straight and make sure Opessa stays in prison where they belong.
It is the state's duty to uphold the law and see to it that victims of crime receive justice. We cannot bring Haumea back, but we can be sure that their killer is behind bars. In the end, that's what this case is about.